You're lying in bed, drifting off, when suddenly you realize you've died. Don't panic in ancient Egypt. This was just the start of the adventure. Forget vague clouds or harps. The Egyptians had a very detailed plan for what happens next. Think of it as the world's longest bedtime story mixed with the strictest airport security line you've ever seen. The Egyptian underworld, known as the Duat, wasn't just a spooky cave. It was a sprawling, mysterious landscape beneath the earth, filled with rivers of fire, shadowy caverns, and gates guarded by beings with names like He who eats shadows and the one who lives on snakes. Basically, the kind of neighbors you don't want when you're trying to sleep. The Egyptians didn't see death as an ending. They saw it as a journey, a cosmic road trip where your soul had to pass through checkpoints, answer riddles, and prove you were worthy of eternal peace. And if you weren't, well, let's just say there was a crocodile-hippo-lion hybrid waiting to eat your heart. This underworld wasn't chaos, it was order. Every step had rules, every gate had passwords, every ritual had meaning. The Egyptians believed that if you prepared properly with spells, amulets, and maybe a few snacks buried in your tomb, you could navigate the Duat and reach paradise. The Field of Reeds, a perfect version of Egypt, where the Nile flowed forever and the crops never failed. So tonight, we're going to wander slowly, humorously, and maybe a little boringly on purpose through the Egyptian underworld. We'll meet jackal-headed gods, peek at mummies, whisper passwords at terrifying gates, and eventually find out whether your heart passes the ultimate test. It's going to be long. It's going to be slow. It's going to be the kind of story that makes your eyelids heavy, while your imagination drifts into shadowy caverns and glowing fields. And by the end, you'll know the secrets of the Egyptian afterlife, or at least you'll be asleep, which is close enough. If you enjoyed this slow stroll through death's doorway, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments from where you're watching from. Bonus points if you're tuning in from a sarcophagus, because honestly, that's the most authentic way to experience this story. For the ancient Egyptians, death wasn't a frightening full stop. It was more like a comma, a pause before the next sentence in the cosmic story. Life was temporary, but the soul eternal. And the Egyptians were determined to make sure that eternal part was comfortable, well-fed, and properly dressed. They believed the human being was made up of several parts, not just flesh and bone. You had your body, sure, but you also had spiritual components that needed careful management. Death wasn't just about burying the body. It was about making sure all those spiritual pieces didn't wander off like confused tourists. To Egyptians, the tomb was less a grave and more a launch pad. You stocked it with food, furniture, amulets, and sometimes even board games, because you never knew what you'd need in the afterlife. Pharaohs went all in, building pyramids stuffed with treasures. Ordinary folks did their best with clay pots and bread loaves, but everyone shared the same belief. Death was a journey, and you needed supplies. The Egyptians also saw death as a return to cosmic order. Life was messy, floods, taxes, neighbors borrowing your goats, but death promised balance. If you lived according to Mat, the principle of truth and harmony, your soul would glide smoothly into the afterlife. If not, well, there was always Amit waiting with an empty stomach. Egyptians wrote endless texts about this. Hymns, prayers, spells, instructions. Whole papyrus scrolls dedicated to making sure you didn't get lost in the Duat. It was like the world's longest travel guide, except instead of top 10 restaurants in Cairo, it was top 10 ways to avoid being devoured by a crocodile hippo lion. So death, for the Egyptians, wasn't frightening. It was structured, organized, and oddly comforting. You knew what to expect: a journey, some gates, a weighing of the heart, and hopefully eternal farming in the field of reeds. The Egyptians believed that a person was not just a body walking around under the sun. You were a collection of parts, each with its own role, each needing careful attention if you wanted to survive death and make it to the afterlife. The Ka was your life force, the invisible spark that kept you breathing and moving. When you died, the Ka didn't vanish. It lingered, hungry, needing offerings of food and drink. That's why tombs were stocked with bread, beer, and sometimes even roast duck, because your Ka had an appetite, and nobody wanted to spend eternity starving. The Ba was your personality, your individuality, the part of you that could fly like a bird. The Egyptians often depicted the Ba as a human-headed bird fluttering out of the tomb. It could leave during the day, wander the world, and then return at night to rest with the body. Imagine your personality as a little bird going on adventures while your mummy stayed tucked away. The Ak was the transformed spirit, the perfected self that emerged after death if all the rituals were done correctly. It was the version of you that could live among the gods, shining and eternal. The Ak was the goal, the final polished version of your soul, ready for eternity. Together, these parts made up the Egyptian idea of the self. Death wasn't just about burying the body. It was about keeping the Ka fed, letting the Ba roam, and ensuring the Ak was properly formed. If any part was neglected, your afterlife journey could go terribly wrong. This is why Egyptian religion was so detailed. Every ritual, every spell, every offering was designed to keep these pieces in harmony. The Qa needed food, the Ba needed freedom, the Ak needed transformation. It was spiritual maintenance, like keeping all the gears of a cosmic machine oiled and running. And so, when an Egyptian looked at death, they didn't see a single soul drifting off. They saw a complex system of forces, each requiring care. The tomb wasn't just a resting place, it was a workshop for the soul, a place where the Ka, Ba, and Ak could continue their work long after the body had stopped breathing. The Egyptians imagined the underworld not as a single cavern but as a vast, winding landscape called the Duat. It stretched beneath the earth like a shadowy mirror of the living world, filled with rivers, mountains, caverns, and gates. To step into the Duat was to enter a place where the rules of daylight no longer applied. The Duat was not chaos. It was structured, mapped, and described in texts that read like travel guides for the dead. Pharaohs had entire tomb walls painted with instructions so their souls wouldn't get lost. Ordinary people relied on papyrus scrolls tucked into their coffins, hoping the right spell would get them past the next terrifying guardian. The geography of the Duat was strange and layered. There were lakes of fire, rivers of darkness, and fields where serpents slithered endlessly. Caverns echoed with the voices of spirits, and gates stood tall, each guarded by beings with names that sounded more like warnings than introductions. To pass through, you needed passwords. Forget the password, and you were stuck, an eternal traveler, stranded at the world's most intimidating checkpoint. But the Duat wasn't only frightening, it was also the stage for renewal. Each night, the sun god Ra traveled through it, battling serpents and demons, only to rise again at dawn. The Egyptians saw this as proof that the Duat wasn't just about endings. It was about cycles, darkness leading back to light, death leading back to life. For the soul, entering the Duat was the first step in a long journey. You weren't expected to wander aimlessly. You had a destination, the hall of judgment, the weighing of the heart, and hopefully the field of reeds. The Duat was the road, winding and dangerous, but necessary. And so, the Egyptians filled their tombs with maps, spells, and charms. They believed that with enough preparation, the soul could navigate the Duats, rivers, and caverns, whisper the right passwords at the gates, and emerge safely into eternity. The Duat was hidden, shadowy, and full of obstacles, but it was also the path to paradise. In the Egyptian imagination, no figure was more closely tied to death and burial than Anubis, the jackal-headed god. His sleek black form, half man and half jackal, was not meant to frighten but to guide. To the Egyptians, jackals prowled cemeteries at night. And so Anubis became the divine guardian of tombs, the one who kept watch over the dead. Anubis was the master of burial rituals. He oversaw the careful wrapping of the body, the placement of amulets, and the recitation of spells. Every step was sacred. To prepare a body was not just hygiene, it was cosmic engineering. The Egyptians believed that if the body was preserved, the soul could recognize it, return to it, and continue its journey. Without Anubis, the process would fail, and the soul would wander lost. Priests who performed the rituals often dressed as Anubis himself, wearing masks to embody his presence. Imagine standing in a dimly lit chamber, incense curling through the air, while a figure with the head of a jackal leans over the body, whispering prayers. It was solemn, eerie, and profoundly important. Burial rituals were not only about preservation, they were about protection. The tomb was sealed with spells carved into walls, charms placed among wrappings, and offerings left for the Ka. Anubis was believed to guard these treasures, ensuring that thieves, spirits, or demons could not disturb the resting place. He also played a role in judgment. In the Hall of Mat, Anubis weighed the heart against the feather of truth. His steady hands held the scales, his watchful eyes ensuring fairness. He was not cruel nor forgiving, simply precise. If the heart was heavy, Amit waited. If the heart was light, the soul passed on. Anubis embodied the Egyptians' deepest hope, that death could be orderly, guided, and safe. With him, the terrifying unknown became a ritual, a path, a process. He was the guardian of cemeteries, the protector of mummies, the keeper of secrets whispered in tombs. And so, every burial in Egypt carried his shadow. Every tomb echoed his presence. Every soul hoped to see his jackal face, not as a threat, but as a guide. When most people think of ancient Egypt, they picture pyramids, pharaohs, and mummies wrapped in endless linen. But the process of mummification was far more than just bandages and spooky tombs. It was a careful, sacred ritual designed to preserve the body so the soul could recognize it. The Egyptians believed the body was essential. Without it, the Ka and Ba, those spiritual parts of you, would have nowhere to return. So mummification wasn't optional. It was the ultimate afterlife insurance policy. The process began with purification. The body was washed, oils applied, and prayers whispered. Then came the part nobody likes to talk about, removing the internal organs. The lungs, stomach, intestines, and liver were carefully taken out and placed in special jars called canopic jars, each guarded by a protective deity. The heart was usually left in place because it would be needed later for the weighing ceremony. The brain, however, was considered useless. It was removed with a hook through the nose and discarded. Imagine being judged for eternity without your brain. The Egyptians thought the heart did all the thinking anyway. Next came drying. The body was covered in natron, a natural salt that absorbed moisture. For weeks, the body lay in this salty embrace, slowly transforming into something that could last forever. Once dried, the body was stuffed with linen, resin, and sometimes even onions to keep its shape. Then came the wrapping. Linen strips were wound carefully around every limb, every finger, every toe. Amulets were tucked between layers, each one carrying protective magic. Priests recited spells as they worked, ensuring the soul would be safe. The wrapping wasn't rushed. It was art. Some mummies ended up with hundreds of meters of linen, layer upon layer, until the body was cocooned like a sacred package. Finally, the mummy was placed in a coffin, often painted with images of gods, spells, and protective symbols. Pharaohs had multiple coffins nested inside each other, like divine Russian dolls. Ordinary people had simpler versions, but the principle was the same. The body was sealed, protected, and ready for eternity. Mummification wasn't just about preservation, it was about transformation. The body became a vessel for the soul, a bridge between life and death, a symbol of eternal continuity. And while modern eyes see bandages and dust, the Egyptians saw sacred magic, a promise that death was not the end. When we think of ancient civilizations, we often imagine women hidden in the background, silent and powerless. But in Egypt, things were a little different. Women had rights that might surprise you, rights to own property, to inherit wealth, to run businesses, and even to divorce their husbands if they felt like it. In a world thousands of years old, that was remarkable. Daily life for women varied depending on class. A farmer's wife might spend her days grinding grain, baking bread, and raising children, while a noblewoman oversaw estates, managed servants, and kept accounts, but both shared a sense of dignity in their roles. Egyptian society valued balance, and women were seen as essential to maintaining it. Marriage was central, but it wasn't a cage. Women could enter contracts, and those contracts protected their property. If a marriage ended, she didn't walk away empty-handed. She kept what was hers. In fact, Egyptian women had more legal independence than many women in later societies. Religion gave women even greater importance. Goddesses like Isis, Hathor, and Nephthys embodied power, love, protection, and wisdom. Women could serve as priestesses, midwives, and mourners in funerary rituals. Their voices carried weight in ceremonies. Their presence was vital in the sacred balance between life and death. Even queens held extraordinary influence. Some ruled outright, like Hatshepsut, who wore the false beard of kingship and commanded armies. Others, like Nefertari, were celebrated for their wisdom and beauty, immortalized in temples alongside their husbands. Yet everyday women mattered just as much. They kept households running, raised children, brewed beer, and wove linen. Their work sustained the living, and their rituals honored the dead. In the grand cycle of Egyptian life, women were not hidden figures, but active participants. So when we picture Egypt, we shouldn't only see pharaohs and pyramids. We should see women grinding grain, managing estates, leading rituals, and shaping the rhythm of daily life. Their reality was complex, practical, and deeply respected. The Egyptian afterlife wasn't only guarded by jackal-headed gods and crocodile-hippo monsters. It was also shaped by powerful goddesses, figures of compassion, protection, and balance. Where Anubis weighed hearts and Osiris judged souls, these goddesses offered comfort, guidance, and sometimes fierce defense. Isis was the Great Mother, the goddess of magic and protection. She was the one who gathered the pieces of Osiris after he was slain, breathing life back into him so he could rule the underworld. For the dead, Isis was a symbol of hope, the promise that even in darkness there was renewal. Her spells were said to guard the soul, her wings to shield the body, and her presence to guide the traveler through the Duat. Nephthys, sister of Isis, was the goddess of mourning and shadow. She stood at the edges of funerary rituals, her voice rising in lamentation. But her role wasn't despair, it was care. She was the one who watched over the dead, ensuring they were not forgotten, ensuring their journey was dignified. In tomb paintings, she often appears alongside Isis, the two sisters flanking the bier, guardians of transition. Hathor brought a gentler touch, known as the goddess of love, joy, and music. She also welcomed souls into the afterlife. She was sometimes imagined as a cow goddess, offering nourishment to the weary traveler. To enter the field of reeds under Hathor's gaze was to be embraced by beauty and abundance. She was the promise that eternity wasn't only solemn, it could be joyful too. Together, these goddesses balanced the harshness of judgment with compassion. They reminded Egyptians that the afterlife wasn't only about scales and punishments. It was also about care, love, and renewal. The soul wasn't abandoned to wander alone. It was guided by divine mothers, mourners, and protectors. Their presence in tombs and rituals gave comfort to the living. Families believed that when they buried their loved ones, these goddesses stood nearby, wings outstretched, voices raised, hands extended. Death was not a lonely passage. It was accompanied by divine women who carried the soul forward. Among the many rituals of ancient Egypt, few were as important for the dead as the opening of the mouth ceremony. It wasn't about dentistry, despite the name. It was about giving the deceased the ability to eat, speak, breathe, and see again in the afterlife. Without it, the soul would be mute, blind, and powerless. With it, the journey through the Duat could truly begin. The ceremony was performed on statues, mummies, and even coffins. Priests, often dressed as Anubis or other gods, carried special tools shaped like ADSs and blades. These weren't weapons, they were symbolic instruments used to touch the mouth, eyes, and ears of the deceased. Each touch was accompanied by prayers, restoring the senses one by one. Imagine the scene. Incense fills the air, chants echo through the chamber, and a priest gently presses a ritual tool against the lips of a mummy. To the Egyptians, this wasn't superstition, it was practical magic. The dead needed to eat offerings, speak spells, and see the path ahead. Without the ceremony, the afterlife would be a silent, dark struggle. The ritual also connected the deceased to the gods. By opening the mouth, the soul could call upon divine names, recite passwords at gates, and join the chorus of voices praising Ra as he sailed through the underworld. It was empowerment, a way of ensuring the dead weren't helpless travelers, but active participants in the cosmic journey. Even statues of gods underwent the ceremony. Temples performed it to animate divine images. giving them the ability to receive offerings and communicate with worshippers. In this way, the ritual bridged the human and divine, the living and the dead. For families, the ceremony was reassurance. They believed their loved one could now eat the bread and beer left in the tomb, speak to the gods, and see the light of eternity. It was closure, a final act of care before sealing the tomb. The opening of the mouth was not a quick gesture. It was a slow, deliberate ritual layered with meaning. Every touch, every word, every breath was part of a larger promise that death was not silence, but transformation. For the Egyptians, death was not a gentle fade into silence. It was a journey, and the first step into the Duat was the most unsettling. Imagine closing your eyes in the world of sunlight and opening them in a realm of shadows, rivers, and guardians, with names that sound like warnings. That was the soul's first night. The Duat was not welcoming. Darkness pressed in from every side, and the air was heavy with mystery. The soul, newly separated from the body, had to find its way through caverns and waterways, guided only by spells and prayers left behind in tombs. Without those instructions, the traveler was lost, wandering endlessly in the night. The first encounters were with guardians, beings with blazing eyes, serpent bodies, and voices that demanded passwords. Each gate was a test. The soul had to speak the right words, remember the right names, and prove its worth. Forget a phrase, and the guardian would block the way. The Egyptians imagined this as a cosmic bureaucracy. Every checkpoint required paperwork. Every passage demanded proof. The night was filled with dangers. Rivers of fire glowed in the distance. Serpents coiled across pathways, and demons lurked in shadows. Yet the soul was not entirely alone. Protective amulets, spells from the Book of the Dead, and the presence of gods like Anubis and Isis offered guidance. The journey was terrifying, but it was also structured. There was a path, and if you followed it, you could survive the night. This first night symbolized transition. The soul was leaving the world of the living and entering the realm of the dead. It was a crossing, a passage, a test of courage. Egyptians believed that with preparation, food offerings, spells, and rituals, the soul could endure the terrors and move forward. And so, the soul pressed on, whispering passwords, clutching amulets, and hoping the guardians would let it pass. The first night in the Duat was not meant to be easy. It was meant to remind the traveler that eternity had to be earned. The Egyptians imagined the Duat as a vast labyrinth, and at its heart were the 12 gates. Each gate marked a stage of the soul's journey through the night, and each one was guarded by beings who were not exactly welcoming. Passing through them was less like strolling through a doorway and more like surviving a cosmic interrogation. The gates were arranged like checkpoints along the path of the sun god Ra, who traveled through the underworld each night. As Ra passed, the gates opened, and the souls who followed him had a chance to slip through, but the guardians demanded passwords, names, and spells. Without them, the gates stayed shut, and the traveler was left stranded in darkness. Each gate had its own guardian, often described with terrifying features, serpent bodies, flaming eyes, or voices that could strike fear into the heart. Some were said to breathe fire, others to devour shadows, and all of them were relentless in their duty. They weren't evil, they were simply doing their job, keeping order in the Duat. The Egyptians believed that the soul needed to know the names of these guardians. Names carried power. To speak a guardian's name was to show respect and prove knowledge. Forget the name, and the guardian would block the way. It was like the world's strictest password system, where every gate had its own code. The journey through the 12 gates symbolized the passage of time. Each gate represented an hour of the night, and together they marked the sun's journey from dusk to dawn. For the soul, following Ra through the gates meant aligning with cosmic order, moving step by step toward renewal. But the gates were not only obstacles, they were also thresholds. Each one brought the soul closer to judgment, closer to the hall of Ma'at, closer to the final weighing of the heart. Passing through them was proof of endurance, preparation, and divine favor. And so the Egyptians filled their tombs with spells, maps, and instructions. They believed that with enough preparation, the soul could whisper the right words, appease the guardians, and pass through all 12 gates. It was a long night, but at the end lay the promise of dawn. If the Duat was a labyrinth of rivers, caverns, and gates, then the Book of the Dead was the ultimate travel guide. Egyptians didn't want their souls wandering aimlessly in the dark, bumping into crocodile demons without a plan. So they wrote down instructions, spells, prayers, and passwords to help the dead navigate the underworld. The Book of the Dead wasn't a single book, but a collection of texts written on papyrus scrolls, tomb walls, and coffins. Each copy was unique, tailored to the person it was buried with. Some were short, with just a few spells. Others were long, filled with hundreds of incantations. Pharaohs had deluxe editions, while ordinary people had simpler versions. But the goal was the same: survival in the afterlife. The spells covered everything. There were spells to open gates, spells to silence demons, spells to transform into animals, and even spells to avoid being eaten by snakes. One spell might let you turn into a falcon and fly past danger. Another might let you slip through walls. It was like carrying a bag of magical cheat codes. The texts also included maps of the Duat, showing rivers, caverns, and guardians. These weren't artistic doodles. They were practical guides. The soul needed to know where to go, what to say, and how to act. Forget the instructions, and you risked being trapped forever. But the Book of the Dead wasn't only about defense. It was about empowerment. The spells gave the soul confidence, reminding it that it wasn't helpless. With the right words, the dead could command respect, pass through gates, and stand proudly before Osiris in the Hall of Judgment. Families believed that burying their loved ones with these texts was an act of care. It was like sending them off with a packed lunch, a map, and a list of emergency phone numbers. The journey was dangerous, but with the Book of the Dead, the soul had a fighting chance. And so, tombs across Egypt were filled with scrolls, inscriptions, and painted spells. The dead carried their knowledge with them, whispering words of power as they moved through the shadows. The Book of the Dead was not forbidden in the sense of secrecy. It was forbidden in the sense that only the prepared could use it. It was sacred knowledge, meant to guide the soul safely to eternity. In the Egyptian afterlife, no moment was more decisive than the weighing of the heart. This was the trial, the judgment, the cosmic courtroom where the soul's fate was decided. Forget lawyers and appeals. Here, the heart itself was the witness, the evidence, and the verdict. The Egyptians believed the heart carried the record of a person's life. Every truth, every lie, every kindness, every cruelty was etched into it. When the soul stood before Osiris, the heart was placed on a scale opposite the feather of Mat, the goddess of truth and balance. If the heart was light, balanced with truth, the soul passed. If it was heavy with wrongdoing, punishment awaited. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, held the scales steady. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe, recorded the results. Osiris presided as judge, seated on his throne, flanked by Isis and Nephthys. It was a solemn scene, painted on tomb walls and described in papyrus scrolls. The soul stood trembling, waiting for the scales to tip. If the heart was pure, the soul was welcomed into the field of reeds, a paradise of eternal harvests and gentle rivers. But if the heart was heavy, Ammit, the crocodile lion hippo monster, waited nearby. She did not forgive, she did not negotiate. She devoured the heart, and with it, the soul's chance at eternity. To the Egyptians, this was the ultimate punishment, not torture, but annihilation. The weighing of the heart was more than a ritual, it was a moral compass. Egyptians lived their lives with Mat in mind, striving for truth, justice, and balance. They believed that every action mattered, every word carried weight. The afterlife wasn't random, it was earned. And so, the weighing of the heart became the centerpiece of Egyptian belief. It was the moment when the soul's story was told, not by priests or gods, but by the heart itself. A silent, honest witness, tipping the scales toward reward or destruction. At the heart of Egyptian belief was Mat, the principle of truth, justice, and cosmic balance. It wasn't just an idea, it was the glue that held the universe together. The Egyptians believed that without Mat, the world would collapse into chaos. Rivers would dry, stars would fall, and the Duat itself would unravel. Mat was personified as a goddess, often shown with a feather on her head. That feather wasn't decoration, it was the very symbol of truth. In the hall of judgment, the heart of the deceased was weighed against it. If the heart matched the feather's lightness, the soul was pure. If not, Ammit waited nearby, ready to devour. But Mat wasn't only about the afterlife, it was about daily life. Egyptians believed every action, from farming to ruling, had to align with Mat. Kings were judged by how well they upheld it. Families were expected to live in harmony with it. Even small acts, honesty in trade, kindness in community, were seen as contributions to cosmic order. Women played a vital role in maintaining this balance. In households, they managed food, weaving, and rituals, ensuring the rhythm of life flowed smoothly. In temples, priestesses honored goddesses, keeping spiritual harmony alive. Queens embodied Mat in politics, advising kings, ruling estates, and sometimes ruling outright. Their presence was not secondary, it was essential. Isis, Hathor, and other goddesses were seen as living embodiments of Mat's principles. They nurtured, protected, and restored balance in both life and death. Women mirrored this divine role in their communities, weaving together the threads of order in everyday existence. To the Egyptians, Mat was not abstract. It was lived, practiced, and embodied. And women, through their work, rituals, and wisdom, were central to keeping the scales balanced. Without them, the feather of truth would falter, and the world would tip toward chaos. At the center of the Egyptian afterlife stood Osiris, the green-skinned god of resurrection and ruler of the underworld. Once a king on earth, slain and restored by Isis, he became the eternal judge of souls. To the Egyptians, Osiris was not only a god of death, but a symbol of renewal, proof that life could rise again from darkness. The court of judgment was his domain. Picture a grand hall, its walls painted with stars, its floor echoing with the footsteps of the dead. Osiris sat upon a throne, flanked by Isis and Nephthys, while Anubis managed the scales and Thoth recorded every outcome. It was a courtroom, but one where no lawyer could argue your case. Your deeds alone spoke for you. The soul entered trembling, carrying its heart, the record of its life. Anubis placed it on the scales against the feather of Mat. If the heart was light, Osiris welcomed the soul with calm authority. If it was heavy, Ammit waited nearby, ready to erase the guilty forever. Osiris was not cruel. His role was balance. He embodied the promise that justice was fair, that truth mattered, that eternity was not given lightly. To stand before him was to face the ultimate test. Had you lived in harmony with Mat, or had you strayed into chaos? The Egyptians filled their tombs with spells to prepare for this moment. They believed words of power could steady the scales. Amulets could protect the heart, and prayers could call upon Osiris's mercy. But in the end, the judgment was simple. The scales tipped, the record was read, and Osiris decided. For those who passed, Osiris opened the way to the field of reeds, a paradise of eternal harvests. For those who failed, silence followed. The court was not a place of endless trials. It was decisive, final, and absolute. And so, Osiris became the figure every soul awaited. Not feared, not hated, but respected. He was the ruler of the Duat, the judge of truth. The god who reminded Egyptians that death was not chaos, but order, not despair, but renewal. In the Egyptian afterlife, few figures were as terrifying as Ammit. She wasn't a goddess, nor a demon exactly, but a creature of punishment. Her body was a patchwork of the most fearsome animals, the head of a crocodile, the front of a lion, and the back of a hippopotamus. To the Egyptians, these were the three deadliest beasts of the Nile, combined into one unstoppable force. Ammit waited patiently in the hall of judgment, crouched beside the scales, where Anubis weighed the heart against the feather of Mat. If the heart was pure, Ammit did nothing. But if the heart was heavy with lies, cruelty, or imbalance, she sprang forward. She devoured the heart, swallowing not just the organ, but the soul's chance at eternity. This was the Egyptians' greatest fear, not torture, not endless suffering, but non-existence. To be eaten by Ammit meant your soul was erased, denied entry to the field of reeds, denied rebirth. You became nothing, forgotten in the cosmic order. Ammit wasn't evil. She was justice in its harshest form. She didn't chase souls or hunt them down. She simply waited, silent and patient, for the guilty to condemn themselves. In this way, she embodied the Egyptians' belief that punishment was not arbitrary. It was the natural consequence of imbalance. Her presence in tomb, art, and texts was a warning. Live truthfully, honor Mat, and you will pass safely. Live selfishly, dishonestly, or cruelly, and Ammit will be waiting. She was the shadow at the edge of judgment, the reminder that eternity had to be earned. And so Egyptians lived with her image in mind. Every act of kindness lightened the heart. Every act of cruelty weighed it down. At the end of life, the scales would decide, and Ammit would either remain silent or feast. For the Egyptians, the ultimate goal of the afterlife was reaching the field of reeds. This was paradise, the reward for a soul that had lived in harmony with At and passed the judgment of Osiris. It wasn't a vague heaven of clouds and harps. It was a perfected Egypt, familiar yet eternal. The field of reeds was imagined as a lush landscape where the Nile flowed endlessly. Crops grew tall without fail, and the air was always gentle. Here, the worthy could farm, fish, and live with their families forever. Work existed, but it was joyful, never exhausting. Harvests were abundant, food was plentiful, and the cycle of life continued without hardship. Pharaohs dreamed of ruling in the field of reeds, just as they had on earth. Farmers dreamed of tending perfect fields. Artisans dreamed of creating without limits. Everyone carried their earthly identity into eternity, but in a world free from suffering. The Egyptians believed that the soul could even reunite with loved ones here. Families who had lived truthfully would meet again, sharing meals and laughter under the eternal sun. Death was not separation. It was reunion in a perfected land. The field of reeds was also a place of divine presence. Gods walked among mortals. Harmony was constant, and the balance of was never broken. It was the promise that truth and justice led not only to survival, but to joy. For the Egyptians, this vision gave meaning to life. Every ritual, every offering, every spell was aimed at securing a place in the field of reeds. It was the reward for honesty, kindness, and devotion. To reach it was to step into eternity, not as a shadow, but as a living soul in a land that never failed. Not every soul made it to the field of reeds. For those who failed the tests of the Duat held darker corners, places of punishment, where cruel fates awaited the wicked. Egyptians didn't imagine eternal torture in the way later cultures did. Instead, they feared annihilation, humiliation, and endless obstacles that kept the soul from peace. Some punishments were symbolic. A soul might be forced to wade through rivers of fire, or be trapped in darkness where no offerings could reach. Others were more direct: demons with knives, serpents with venom, or guardians who struck down the unworthy. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were cosmic consequences for breaking taboos. Taboos mattered deeply. To disrespect the gods, to cheat in trade, to lie in judgment, or to harm the innocent was to weigh the heart down. The Egyptians believed that every violation of tipped the scales toward chaos, and chaos was the enemy of eternity. The cruelest fate was to be devoured by Ammit, erased from existence. But even lesser punishments were terrifying. Imagine wandering endlessly, unable to eat the offerings left in your tomb, unable to speak the spells that might save you. To the Egyptians, this was worse than pain. It was helplessness. Tomb texts warned of these dangers, describing demons with names like he who lives on snakes or she who cuts shadows. Each represented a fear, a reminder that the afterlife was not guaranteed. Preparation was everything. Spells, amulets, and rituals were shields against these cruel fates. And so, Egyptians lived carefully, honoring respecting taboos, and filling their tombs with protections. They believed that with truth and preparation, the soul could avoid the punishments, pass safely through the Duat, and reach the eternal fields. But for those who ignored the balance, the underworld was waiting, with cruel fates carved into its shadows. The Egyptian underworld may have been imagined thousands of years ago, but its echoes still ripple through modern culture. From movies to novels, video games to museum exhibits, the Duat and its gods continue to fascinate us. Think of the countless films where mummies rise from tombs, curses unfold, and scarabs scuttle across the desert sands. These aren't just spooky tropes, they're inspired by the rituals and beliefs of ancient Egypt. The idea of a soul navigating trials after death has shaped horror stories, fantasy adventures, and even comic books. The weighing of the heart against the feather of mat has become a metaphor in literature and philosophy. Writers use it to explore morality, conscience, and the weight of truth. Even in everyday speech, we talk about light hearts and heavy hearts, unknowingly echoing Egyptian judgment scenes. Video games and pop culture often borrow directly from the Duat players. Battle guardians solve puzzles based on tomb inscriptions and face bosses modeled after Amit or Anubis. The underworld becomes a stage for adventure, where ancient spells and modern imagination collide. Museums keep the fascination alive, displaying mummies, scarabs, and papyrus scrolls. Visitors peer at these relics, wondering what secrets they hold. The Egyptian vision of death, structured, ritualized, and filled with gods, continues to inspire awe. Even in spiritual discussions, echoes remain. The idea that life is judged, that truth matters, that balance is essential. These are timeless lessons. The Egyptians may have wrapped their dead in linen and filled tombs with spells, but the core message still resonates. How we live shapes what comes after. The legacy of the Egyptian underworld is not just in artifacts or stories. It's in the way we imagine death, justice, and eternity. It's in the way we tell tales of journeys through darkness, guarded by strange beings, ending in either reward or punishment. The Duat lives on, not as a literal place, but as a cultural memory woven into our art, our language, and our imagination. Basically, the ancient blueprint for every spooky movie, moral metaphor, and video game dungeon you've ever seen. If you enjoyed this slow stroll through echoes of eternity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments from where you're watching from. Bonus points if you're tuning in from under a blanket, because, honestly, that's the most authentic way to experience this story. And with that, close your eyes, let the echoes of the Nile fade into dreams, and drift gently into your own field of reeds. Good night.